Terrific. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be here with Oyebola and talking about the slave trades. Today, we're going to consider a question that has come up in a lot of the previous classes and through the chat, and that is really, what is the link between the slave trades and Africa's relative development compared to other continents around the world? Is there a relationship at all between this episode of history and economic development today? Okay, so I'm going to cover some of the literature, primarily from economics, but also history, that touches on this subject. Okay. So if we think about what do we mean by the slave trades, right? So you have probably heard of the transatlantic slave trade, which is actually one of 4 slave trades that occurred simultaneously on the African continent. So you can see here by this map, this is the transatlantic slave trade. Would have been individuals being enslaved and shipped from the coast here and then the coast here and shipped to the Americas. Okay, and so that's kind of the slave trade that we're most familiar with. But there were other, as I mentioned, three other slave trades. One is the trans-Saharan slave trade, where slaves were individuals were taken from this area here and shipped to Northern Africa, and from there some to Europe and to other parts of the world, but a lot would have stayed in Northern Africa. There's the Red Sea slave trade, where individuals were enslaved in this area here and shipped through Red Sea ports, and typically to the Middle East, and some as far as India even. And then finally, the Indian Ocean slave trade, where individuals were enslaved primarily from the eastern coast of the continent and also Madagascar, and shipped to, again, the Middle East and as far as India, but also the plantation islands in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius and Réunion. So this occurred over a 400 period of time. Some of the slave trades, so the Saharan and the Red Sea, are actually older than the transatlantic, predate it. And there's evidence of those trades going on as early as 800 AD, okay? And so one point is these were large trades. So this is some data, which is from my research I'll talk a little bit about. And these are very conservative estimates. So these are basically estimates of the total number of individuals that were enslaved and then shipped in during these slave trades, okay? And you can see that it's kind of easily 16 million people, right? This is certainly an underestimate, and an even larger underestimate, the number of individuals who were raided, died on the way to the coast, died before arriving at the final destination. So this is where the estimated number of individuals that arrived at their destination. And then if you think of the number of individuals whose lives were disrupted and severely affected by the trades, it would be orders of magnitude. And we can only kind of guess how many more individuals were affected by the trade, 4 times, 5 times, etc. Okay, so it's a large period of time spanning from 1400 until as late as 1900, if we look at the data. There are many, many mechanisms and reasons that we think the slave trade may have had detrimental effects. Okay, so ethnic fractionalization, ties between village federations, which may have been forming in a process that was very similar to what was going on in Europe. Joseph Inikori has written about this extensively. Those broke down, right? And so there were ties or federations, maybe counterfactually in a few centuries, these would have turned into large, powerful states. But instead, these villages are raiding one another to protect themselves. Similarly, political fractionalization and weakening of states, pre-existing states that did exist, like the Congo Kingdom, experienced civil wars. There is intra-community raiding and kidnapping, even at the very local, the family level, as you saw. And then a breakdown of traditional judicial systems. So pre-existing institutions became corrupted and became weakened because of the slave trade, okay? So this then raises the question, right? So these are all kind of more short run effects. Are there long run consequences? Do these consequences persist, or have they persisted until today? And are they one of the reasons that we have relative underdevelopment on the African continent relative to other continents. And so in grad school, this is around 2002, I was reading, this literature, which is fascinating and important because I am interested, or was interested in economic development and development, particularly on the African continent. There was really two different views you read in the literature. One is that the slave trades were detrimental to African development. So you see this clearly in the work of Basil Davidson, Walter Rodney, which some people through the chat have already mentioned, Joseph Inikori, and then even Patrick Manning, who will join us tomorrow. He has a great quote conjecturing or suggesting that the roots of modern day corruption are in the slave trade. Okay. And so here's a quote from Joseph Inikori that says, "A consequence of the slave trade was to alter the direction of the economic process in Africa away from development and towards underdevelopment and dependence." Okay. But that wasn't the only view. There was a number of individuals that say, no, the slave trade, it was terrible. It had disruptive effects at the time, but it's in no way responsible for underdevelopment. Okay. And so this is from David Northrop. "While it is true that the slave trade was cruel and produced a climate of fear and suspicion, its social and economic effects, which can be measured, were surprisingly benign." Okay, this was a 1978 publication. Since that point, he actually has a book now, which is 7 Myths of African History. And one of the myths, I can't remember, number 3 or 4, is that the slave trade was economically detrimental, right? And this is similar, if you read the work of John Fage, you have a similar impression. So just 2 different views. And I think this is where my research comes in. It's, well, how can we get to the bottom of this? And reading this, it was kind of assertions, and there's kind of limited evidence on this, despite the fact that in this quote, the economic effects which can be measured were surprisingly benign, right? So there really wasn't, I felt, quantitative evidence, empirical evidence to test this. Okay, so what I sought to do was to really take this to the data and ask, are the slave trades responsible for part of the underdevelopment of the African continent? Okay, so certainly we wouldn't expect one event to explain everything in the world today, but is it a contributor? And so the logic of the analysis, the statistical analysis that I'll take you through, is if that's the case, right, that the slave trade did have these long-term detrimental effects, which persist until today, if we look within the continent, we'd expect that those regions that were more affected by the slave trades should be less developed or poorer today, by whatever metric you want to use, if it's GDP per capita, infant mortality, et cetera. Okay. And so in the end, what you have is you have estimates of the number of individuals which were from land or locations that are within a modern country today that were enslaved during all 4 of the slave trades. Okay. And this gives you some estimates. In the paper itself, you have the full list for all countries in the world, right? So you can see Angola, a lot of individuals were enslaved, primarily during the transatlantic slave trade. Nigeria, during the transatlantic, but also during the trans-Saharan. So a lot of individuals who were enslaved were shipped north and also to the Red Sea. Places like Ethiopia, it was primarily the trans-Saharan and Red Sea slave trades. Okay. So then the statistical test, or the very first step, is let's look at the relationship between the number of individuals who were enslaved. We want to normalize by the size of the country, right? So Guinea-Bissau is a very different size than the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we want to normalize. So it's the total number of enslaved individuals divided by the land area. And this is shown on a log-log scale, so a natural log on both sides, on both axes. And what you find is a negative relationship, right? And quite robust negative relationship, it turns out. And in other words, those countries, or areas that today are countries that had more individuals taken, today are poorer, okay, as measured by per capita GDP. Okay, again, you can, if you have other measures of relative economic success you want to use, you can use those as well. Again, kind of like this, the issue about did the slave trade have long run effects? There was also a debate in historical literature, same, a lot of the same characters, John Fage versus Walter Rodney, about whether there always was slavery. Okay, and so there's one view that, oh, there always was slavery, and then the Europeans came, and then they sold these individuals who were already enslaved. Okay, and so there's definitely some mention of domestic slaves or servants in the early 16th century, but in general, you can think of these as being different than what we call slaves during the slave trade, right? So they're considered to be part of the family. In no sense were they chattel, that the family that took them in. So for example, if they didn't have enough to eat, or if there's other reasons that they were absorbed into the lineage of one family, in no sense could those individuals be bought and sold. There was no market for enslaved individuals, and the children of those individuals were not chattel, that individuals that could then be bought and sold. So it's very different from the situation after the slave trades began. And so the best evidence from this, and kind of the hard evidence that I've seen, and so what persuaded me on one way or another, rather than just the opinions of historians, is linguistic evidence from Anne Hilton and Jan van Sina, right? And here the linguistic evidence is shown in this map, which is from an article by Jan van Sina called in the journal History in Africa, 1989. And we've already talked about, well, how do you undertake historical research if there are no written records? Okay, and Chris Eric talked about, well, linguistic evidence is extremely useful. Okay, and you can take an object, right? So like a slave, and think about, is this object, which is a traded individual, a traded enslaved individual, indigenous? So how do you know this, whether it's indigenous? Well, if it's indigenous, you should see an indigenous word that describes that object. Okay, if it's a foreign technology, then most likely that foreign technology, that foreign object was introduced, and with it, because you didn't have that indigenously, the term or the word for that. Okay, and so in this article, he looks at, well, what are slaves called? And what slaves are called, peça, right? Which was originally a Portuguese term which meant servant, or in Portuguese, piece or unit, right? And after 1500, it came to refer a traded slave, and it was also the international currency in many places, including the Congo Kingdom. Okay, so there's this term for traded slave, peça, and which originated from the word peça, which is a Portuguese word. And then let's look at its distribution. You can see its distribution here, right? So the first is all of these different societies didn't have their own words for traded slave, okay? Instead, they have a common word, and this common word is connected to the coast here. And so this is completely consistent with traded slaves, this notion arising at the coast, right? Where you have the transatlantic slave trade, and then spreading inland with waves of capture, waves of enslavement that occurred over time. Okay, so this is really the best evidence that traded slaves, chattel, was not endogenous, right? So having individuals that could be bought and sold is not indigenous, but instead it was a concept, something that was introduced from the outside. Okay, so there's been a number of subsequent studies which have looked at other factors which were affected by the slave trades. I won't go through all of these, but it's kind of amazing. Each year another study comes out showing that the slave trades, or providing evidence that the slave trades affected some other characteristic of certain groups within the African continent. So polygyny, for example, has been found to have been increased because of the slave trades, particularly the transatlantic slave trade. So this is men having multiple wives, and there's a number of reasons why this might be. Yeah, but the sex that was primarily taken during the transatlantic slave trade was men. And so you had a gender imbalance in those locations where more enslaved individuals were taken. And so that could be part of the explanation. Female genital cutting has also been associated with the trades. Gender roles, HIV prevalence, stronger beliefs in traditional religious beliefs, what in the West we call witchcraft, conflict, financial development, etc. Okay, so the very last thing before I conclude is I want to think about the question, well, what would the African continent look like if the slave trades had not occurred? I think this is a question that a lot of people have asked in the chat from the very beginning. And so the quantitative analysis that I undertook actually allows you to have a precise answer, or at least a precise guess, our best guess at this. So one way to think of this, so what this is showing here on the y-axis is real per capita GDP. And then what we've done, each dot is a country. And it's a country, all countries in the world. So we have nearly 200 of these dots. So this is, I think, Luxembourg, the US, and they're ordered from lowest per capita GDP measured in 2000 to highest per capita GDP measured in 2000. Okay, so this is the ranking or the ordering. So you can see there's a lot of inequality in the world. It's a lot of countries that have really low GDP, and then a smaller number that have high levels of GDP per capita. Okay, and then the other thing you can see is the red dots. What are those? Those are dots. Those are countries which are on the African continent. So in other words, those are what we call African countries. Okay, so if you look at this, they're not evenly distributed. Okay, there's this clear. If you think of the poorest, I can't remember what that is, poorest 25 countries in the world, 23 of them are on the African continent. Okay, so when people say, oh, you know, the African continent is the poorest continent in the world, or particularly poor, this is the data that they're referring to. This is what they're referring to. So what we can do from the estimates, from all of that statistical analysis, we have estimates of what was the effect of enslavement on income per capita today. And for each country, we know how much enslavement there was. So we can undertake a counterfactual or calculate, well, what would their income have been if instead of, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of enslaved individuals taken from that country, 0 were taken, right? In other words, what would have happened if there was no slave trade in that country? Okay, so once you do that, this is what you get. Okay, so you can see that global income has gone up, right? Because now we have the slave trade. Okay, and then, but the other thing to look at is, well, let's look at the distribution of these red dots. Okay, so it's no longer the case that they're bunched way to the left. If we think of, well, maybe all of these countries from here over, so the 150 less developed countries in the world, we would call those developing countries, right? So that to be not OECD, not Europe, not European offshoots. You see that the countries from Africa are pretty well represented. They're pretty evenly distributed throughout that group. So what does this mean? I think one way to say this in words is, if the slave trades had not occurred, countries within Africa would look very similar to other less developed countries, right? Look similar to South Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, Latin American countries. It wouldn't be this exceptional place, this continent where you have less development than other parts of the world, right? European countries in their offshoots would still be exceptional, but Africa would not be exceptional in terms of thinking about the rest of the world, okay?